Okay, let's go ahead and get at it. I hope you're having a great Thanksgiving break. You're still on break, so it's Monday following Thanksgiving. Since you're on break, I thought I'd go ahead and move us along in the class. We will look at the rest of the media chapter here and then go ahead and maybe even scratch the surface of political parties. We'll see how we're doing in regard to time. Okay, so the last thing we left off on is we were talking about digital media, digital-only media, and remember these would be sources of media identified by the fact that they've had no print precursor. That say they went straight to a web venue. Most of these, of course, their biggest problem is financially. They really cannot sustain themselves. Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, they've done pretty well. Most of them have not done well. The biggest concern, of course, is really the ability to prove veracity of what it is that they're saying, what it is that they're reporting. They've had some real challenges over the years with that. But again, when it comes to this idea of digital versus social media, digital only media and social media, it's really hard to separate the two. What separates Huffington Post from perhaps Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, generally reputation, credibility, but again, and those are two extreme cases. I'm not certainly discounting BuzzFeed or Huffington Post, but again, it's really the credibility. But one of the things to make, I would make mention of is that most employers, the great majority of employers, are actually giving their employees training on social media, largely to prevent any disaster, something that might be posted that would be really, really unsettling to clients, customers, the public, etc., something that might jeopardize their reputation. We on the University of Akron faculty actually have a superstar researcher in this particular area. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the functions of media. Now, again, what we're going to do is really break this down a little bit more than what you're probably used to. I mean, first thing you would think of, well, you know, the function of the media is to report the news, and that's really it. Well, there's a little bit more to it. And one of the things to keep in mind is that certainly the media could allow all Americans to have the same collective sense of news, in the sense that, you know, if it's being broadcasted, then whether you're in Alaska or in Puerto Rico, you're going to be able to see the same news, and that kind of helps. And that's certainly a little bit different than what print media was many moons ago. Although even with print media having web-based outlets, affiliations, you can see this same content. So it's getting a little bit more. Now, one of the things that you have to realize with media, the first function is it is a source of entertainment. If you think about what people do with their spare time, what people do with their leisure time, there's a finite amount of time in the day, in the week, in the month, etc. And when you're not working, you think about how it is that you spend your time. Well, a lot of people will spend time with news, right? I myself am a news junkie. I'm a newspaper junkie, and I've turned a little bit towards the web sources. So if I think about the stuff that I read, the local papers, Plain Dealer, Beacon Journal, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, they all have a web-based format, so it makes it a little bit easier. But with that said, there is a finite amount of time, and the media knows that it absolutely has to compete with all the other sources of media, regular television programming, etc. Now, it is true, however, that the media has really gained a reputation for focusing on the negative, right? Whether it's, and for our purposes, really negative politics or negative anything. A lot of research has shown, again, those that really study this stuff, the only other profession that's really seen as more negative than politics is business, and that probably tells you quite a bit. But what about this mix? When does pure news reporting separate itself from entertainment? And it's really hard to say if you think about this raw competition for time. And of course, when they get close to each other, how do you separate the two? So, for instance, you think about Saturday Night Live and how for decades, starting probably with Chevy Chase and his portrayals of President Ford, even through what we have today with Donald Trump and Alec Baldwin, you get the idea that maybe people are actually getting their news from Saturday Night Live. That is to say, those mocking, derisive probably, portrayals of politicians, Tina Fey doing Sarah Palin, as actually conveying news and might actually affect the way people vote. That is to say, if Saturday Night Live makes a real joke out of somebody like a Donald Trump or a Sarah Palin or Barack Obama, that may hurt them or perhaps help them. There's been a lot of research there. What about candidates going on late night television shows? President Kennedy, then candidate Kennedy in 1960 for the first time doing that. Does it have an impact? It's really hard to tell. Now, again, when President Clinton, probably the all-time if you think about it, a couple of years when he was caught up in the Monica Lewinsky scandal, there were just literally thousands of jokes. The researchers tallied about President Clinton. I think Jay Leno probably had the high point of his career about 20 years ago, going through some of those jokes. Pretty funny, even still to this day. But the question is really whether that has an impact when you see that intermingling, or can people really separate the two, pure entertainment from pure news? But again, they do get it can get confusing. Okay, so let's look at the true press functions. What we would traditionally assume with the media outside of entertainment, and we start with surveillance. Now, if this sounds familiar to you, it should, because interest groups do the same thing. All right, they serve as government watchdogs. Is government doing what it says it's going to do? Are leaders who run government doing what they promised to do when they ran for office? Are they spending money appropriately? Are they following the law when spending money? And this is all the way from the federal government and Congress to your local village council, right, in a small town. But all along the while, remember, when the media is serving as a source of surveillance, they are picking and choosing what is important and what is not. And again, this is going to be a recurring theme through really the rest of this particular chapter, that especially with commercial media, all right, there are always constraints. When you think about television and radio, there are time constraints. With print sources and even the online versions of those print sources, there are constraints in terms of space, content, in terms of gigabytes, terabytes, etc., whatever space. They do have to pick and choose whatever it is that they wish to put. Now, investigative reporting has, it does serve as a surveillance function, but one of the questions that pops up often is whether investigative reporting has made surveillance a form of muckraking, which is kind of an old term, whereby investigative reporting really focuses on the sensational story or the juicy story. If it bleeds, it leads, that kind of thing, versus some of the social good that can come from investigative reporting, such as what we've seen with the death penalty. Christopher Smith has done a lot of work on this. With that said, think about how many investigative reports have researched the death penalty and find out, hey, maybe we've made mistakes. Maybe we have people on death row that didn't commit certain crimes. See, the good with the bad, kind of the sensationalism with the not so sensational stuff. Okay, next function, again, this section we're talking about in terms of press functions, is interpretation. The media does help us interpret these events. Society is very, very complex. The media helps us put things in terms of context, right? You go back to thinking about Rosa Parks and her arrest in 1955 because she would not give up her seat to a white person and go to the back of the bus. Well, in 1955, she's a lawbreaker, right? She's a criminal, right? At least at that point in time. But very, very quickly, of course, being seen as a civil rights leader, which she absolutely was, a victim, I think clearly. But again, context can certainly change very, very quickly. I think the same thing could be said, and again, I'm borrowing it again from Christopher Smith's work. When you think about our entry into the Iraq War in 2003, the idea that there are weapons of mass destruction and we need to define what these are, and the media reporting that, but then also very, very quickly realizing that there were no weapons of mass destruction at all, and we are, still to this day is stuck in a war. We had to get rid of Saddam Hussein because of his connections to Al Qaeda. It turns out that Saddam Hussein and Al Qaeda weren't tied to each other at all. But again, figuring these things out. Now, with that said, when it comes to interpretation, one of the things that does pop up is this belief perhaps that the media is too liberal. That is to say, maybe it has a bias to it. And is it the network? Is it the flavor of the story? Is it the actual reporter? Now, there has been some research done in this particular area, and it turns out 50% of reporters, right, when polled, have identified themselves as Democrats, right? Whereas 4 have only identified themselves as Republicans. So you have, roughly, 46% that have identified themselves as independents. But you compare that with numbers whereby 34% of Americans identify themselves as Democrats and 28% identify themselves as Republicans. You have a real potential skew. The reality is that there is really no there's no empirical evidence showing that there is a bias in the media, that political party affiliation on behalf of a reporter really leaks into the news. Now, with that said, the networks are a little bit different. So aside from the individual reporters, we have seen some differences in regard to reporters, so or a difference between networks and reporters. So just as an example, during the 2012 campaign, all right, so again, this would have been the incumbent President Obama running against Mitt Romney. All right, just to kind of give you an example of 3 networks. So in the Fox News, the overall reporting during the campaign, 50% of the reporting on President Obama was negative, 6% was positive. For the Republican Romney, 12% from Fox coverage was negative and 28% was positive. Okay? Now, what about CNN? When reporting about President Obama, 21% was negative, 18% was positive. In regard to candidate Romney, 36% was negative, 11% was positive. So with CNN, really more negative than positive with both candidates, although the difference being a little less between Obama's figures and Romney's figures. If you look at MSNBC, this is kind of the flip side of Fox News, if you will. 15% of the reporting for President Obama was negative, 39% was positive. For candidate Romney, 71% was negative, and 3% was positive. So again, a huge gap really there. So, one of the ways you could look at this is that Fox News was the more conservative network, MSNBC was the more liberal network, and CNN kind of somewhere right smack in the middle, just negative about everything, if you will, with maybe a little slight less negativity towards the incumbent President Obama. Now, what about this, the idea of the audience? So for those who consistently identify themselves as conservative, 47% get their news from Fox and 11% from other sources. Those who identify themselves as consistently liberal tend to get a variety get their news from a variety of sources. 15% from CNN, 13% from NPR, 12% from MSNBC, and 10% from the New York Times. Okay, now you start to see a little bit of a connection between the audience and the network. And as we had mentioned before in this section, if there's something you want to hear, you can find it, right? So if you want to hear pro-conservative, anti-liberal all right, news report, you go to Fox. If you want to see just the opposite, you can go to MSNBC. If you want to see things that are negative about everybody, maybe you go to CNN. I don't know. Okay, but you get the idea. Okay, interpretation is a very important part of the media's function, but again, how this is interpreted. In regard to the reporters, there does not seem to be any empirical evidence that really affects the reporting. When you tie it to the networks, there does seem to be a relationship there, and it's probably due to the connection between the network and their market, and really less with the reporters. Okay, what about socialization, right? Well, one of the things we spent a lot of time talking about in regard to politics this semester is how do we get socialized? And we talked about other influences, family. One of them, of course, was family, schools, peers, community. One of them is, of course, the media. The media tells us what it is that's important, right? But again, it's also serving as a filter. So especially in a country whereby our media is really private sector, right? There's really almost no public sector media, state university newspapers, television stations, things like that. Maybe some local government access, cable access channels, but really it's all private sector. When you think about the private sector, there's always going to be that constraint. It's either time or space or maybe a mix of the two. So the government really has no control over how these things are being reported or what's being reported. Okay, so if you think about it, the media is defining our culture, helping us define our culture, socializing us, telling us what issues are important, giving us the facts, and perhaps maybe in a uniquely American way. Now, one of the questions becomes, however, is that, you know, given the fact that media is really a private sector here in this country, what are the ethical requirements? What are the ethical constraints of media? If the public wants violence and sex, should it get violence and sex versus what might be maybe a more socially positive collection of news stories? For the most part, there are really no restraints, no governmental restraints, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So it's really up to the individual stations. It's not to say the media doesn't report on positive stories, role models, heroes, holidays, things like that. But again, there's a lot of negativity. Okay, so let's talk about political use of the media. Now, as we had mentioned, interest groups use the media. Everybody uses the media. Candidates, political parties, interest groups, as we had just mentioned. A lot of interest groups, of course, are tied to some form of political party affiliation. So, again, not a shock to any of us. So let's talk about how politicians make news. And we're going to start with this idea of earned media coverage. Now, earned media coverage, for our purposes, is going to be free media. All right. So the idea is that, you know, when you're buying radio ads, TV ads, print ads, that costs money. But how do you get the free stuff, right? Where CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, even the local stations will go out of their way to cover what it is that you're saying, okay? For the most part, you can actually value how much free news coverage candidates receive. Now, a lot of this is conducted through what we call pseudo events. The idea is we just stage something. We stage a media event, a conference, things like that. Probably one of the most famous, and again, borrowing from Christopher Smith a little bit here. In 2003, President Bush on an aircraft carrier right after the Iraq War had begun, saying that mission accomplished, Iraq is free of Al-Qaeda. And it turns out none of that, of course, was true, but certainly free media coverage. The idea is you're staging an event. Now, does it cost the government some money to stage that event? Of course. I mean, there's no kidding, no question about that. Now, think about presidential campaigns and candidates, right? If you're the front runner, we're going to talk about front runners here in a couple different circumstances, but if you're the front runner, you can command a lot of attention from the media. You're going to be out in front of it, and you'll get that free coverage. So the better you do, again, thinking about presidential races, the better you do in primaries, the more the media is going to go follow you. Okay. Now, you think in the 2016 campaign, whether it be positive or negative. Secretary Clinton, Hillary Clinton, was the leader in the Democratic primary through the Democratic primaries. It's not to say Bernie Sanders wasn't close in a couple of situations, a couple times. And President Trump was also out ahead. And if we were to value it, President Trump earned $1.9 billion in free media, and Secretary Clinton $746 million in free media coverage. Now, again, that's stuff you simply cannot buy. Does it cost a little bit of money to get there? Yeah, I mean, there are things you have to do. You have to make sure your candidate's present. That takes staffing and that takes travel and things like that. But again, it's really hard to put that, when it comes to that free press, it's hard to give that up. It's hard to say that any of that's bad, even the bad stuff. Okay, now, with that said, let's go ahead and look at how journalists report the news. Now, starting with agenda setting, all right? The media does set the agenda for us, and agenda setting really has three parts to it. The first of which being deciding what issues to cover. Okay. Now, there's a flip side to that. If you're deciding what issues to cover, you're also deciding what is not important, what issues not to cover. And again, getting back to that idea that media in this country is commercial, it's private sector, there are constraints, time constraints, space constraints. Deciding what to and what not to report is a pretty big deal. Number two, in what detail. All right, so what is important is one question. How much time are you going to spend with it? How many details should the public know? Again, getting back to the constraints of time and space, right? That will help dictate that as well. All right, and of course, placing things in context. Okay, so if you think about, going back to Rosa Parks and how that context had changed actually fairly quickly, from lawbreaker to civil rights activist. We talked about the Declaration of Success in 2003 in Iraq, right? The banner, mission accomplished, which is something you can find on a YouTube video, I'm sure. Very quickly realizing that, things were not accomplished in a couple of months' time, right? The ideas would, in fact, we're still there at some level here, 15 years later, almost 16 years later. Okay, so with that said, again, when you're deciding what issues to cover and in how much detail and in what context, you're also deciding what issues not to cover, what details not to cover, and what context might be perhaps irrelevant, okay? Now, when you think about context, it's probably maybe the most, the point where you can align that with the network. Again, Fox might take one angle, one context, and CNN might take another, and MSNBC may take a third even from there. Okay, gatekeepers, right? Deciding what issues should be on the public agenda. Okay, now again, this gets back to that first question, deciding what issues to cover, but also deciding what issues not to cover. Okay, now there are again no restraints imposed by government. The First Amendment is that powerful. So when it comes to gatekeeping, all right, and one of the most important things you can get down in your notes on this point is in our country, we are really relying on the market to determine what should be presented and what should not be presented, what should be reported and what should not be reported. Now think about why that is, right? We're assuming that if TV stations, radio stations, newspapers don't cover the issues that people want to read about, hear about, watch, they'll just go out of business. So the media has that incentive to follow what it is that what people want to hear, okay? And you get into this really uneasy tension where maybe people want to see these things, and that's what will keep you in business, versus a journalist's ethical code leading them to believe that something else should be covered, and it's maybe going to be something that'll bankrupt you because nobody wants to listen to it, okay? Now, having said that, gatekeeping has actually become a little bit easier for the media. Again, largely because, as we've said before, if there's a viewpoint that you want, you can go find it. Okay, so what is important to one network might not be important to another. What's important to one newspaper might not be important to another, although we're going to talk about some of the consolidation issues that we've seen here lately. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the special case of the president. Now, because of the unity of the office, right, there's only one president of the United States. It's the only person that, at least indirectly, because of the Electoral College, we elect across the country right along with the vice president. You know, the president of the United States is going to get a lot more coverage. Less than the courts, less than Congress, right? Now, presidents have been very good at trying to control the message. If they know they're going to be followed, they're going to try to do something about it, right? Think about President Trump right now with all of his tweets, right? They are covered. Almost every morning I wake up and I'm listening to the news and driving into work. I hear about it, but he's trying to manage, right, the flow of the media. Okay. Now, President Clinton, who didn't have Twitter wasn't out, but he had lots of speeches, lots of public talks. All right, almost 2 per day in his. During his presidency. Ronald Reagan, known as the great communicator, did something very, very similar. Of course, Reagan being so incredibly comfortable with television, again, a former actor, former movie star, and probably, you know, people forget that Ronald Reagan was probably known best as a spokesperson, right, as a commercial spokesperson for GE. You know, just being incredibly comfortable in front of the media. Not all politicians, even in the modern age, are comfortable in front of the camera. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about again, still talking about the special case of the presidency. Some of the things that the media will do, or I should say, the White House will do on behalf of the president with the media. The first is the press release. Now, a press release is always a written statement. You would consider these things routine. You're hoping that when you release whatever bit of news you want released to the media will use the exact same language, the same coverage, same angle that you put it out, that they won't say tweak the language or play around with the language. But I would consider press releases to be fairly routine. And again, it's not just the White House, it's every branch of government, it's every level of government, etc. Okay, news briefings. I would also consider these to be routine, but news briefings generally do not include the president, all right? This is Sarah Sanders, who you've seen probably 1 million times, get out in front of the media and simply answer questions almost on a daily basis, if in some cases twice per day, although that's pretty rare, but at least once a day. And she'll just answer questions. Now, what's nice, of course, about the news briefing is that a lot of the times this is a two-way street. So certainly Sarah Sanders will deliver some information. She will also answer questions, but in answering those questions, she gets a sense of what's important out there. She'll get an idea as to what the media is thinking and be able to go back and perhaps retool. Okay, but I would consider that routine. So press releases, routine. Press conferences, news conferences, routine. Okay, press conferences. Now, what about a news conference? Now, this is something that's much more staged. This actually involves the candidate. This would involve President Trump. He does not do this very often. President Obama did it quite often. President Clinton was almost, all the time. Very good at it. Now, with that said, this is something I would not consider to be routine. All right, these are special occasions, special events. You think about when these things usually take place. They unfortunately take place during very harrowing events, horrible crime scenes. If you think about the mass shooting at the Tree of Life Temple in Pittsburgh, that would be a good example where President Trump was willing to engage in a news conference and take questions. Okay, some presidents have a high comfort level with these, others do not. But one of the things we are learning is that presidents, even if they are not comfortable with this, they're going to have to get comfortable, because this kind of coverage, right, video coverage, certainly isn't going away. Okay, now let's look a little bit at covering Congress. Now, when it comes to covering Congress, because of the lack of a unity of office, they just don't get as much attention, right? So, you think about what Congress is. It's 535 members of the House and Senate together, and of course there are delegates mixed in there as well. It's too much of a scattered message really for national networks to cover. So they just don't do it, right? So what they might do is cover the entity, what's going on in Congress, but not the individuals for sure, all right? Now, where the individual congresspersons are covered is by their local media. So senators within their state, members of the House within their districts, wherever that media market might be. You think about in Ohio, Marcy Kaptur would probably be a good example of somebody who has a district that covers really two media markets, Toledo and Cleveland, which is kind of rare, to be honest. Tim Ryan here locally between Akron, maybe a little bit of Cleveland and Youngstown, so maybe two there as well. All right, now the courts are just generally not covered really at all. All right, they just don't get a whole lot of media coverage. Now, you might say, why? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, this is really just not part of the judicial culture. This is not really part of what judges do. The overwhelming majority of judges do not grant interviews. They don't make public statements, although again, just recently, Chief Justice John Roberts had made kind of a rebuke, a comment in rebuke to some of the attacks President Trump had made about a district court decision recently, and John Roberts said, look, we don't have Trump judges or Obama judges, Clinton judges, etc. We have a federal bench, and let us do our job. Thank you very much. It was number one, very rare, two, incredibly polite, but nonetheless, that's an incredibly rare thing. But even at the state level, when you think about judges running for office, you don't hear much from them, right? They don't do this kind of stuff very often. They don't go out of their way and seek media attention. And that's true even of judges that have to run for office as they do in Ohio. That's one of the things that makes judicial campaigns so incredibly boring, right? It's like they trying to get up there and say, well, I promise to be fair and impartial, and of course that's what you would expect. And every now and again you'll get some of the media, their commercials will say tough on crime or something like that, but it's almost innocuous in most circumstances. So when will the courts really get some attention? Well, only if it's something that's very, very high profile. And if you think about recently what we've seen, if I were to package, the last 30 years together, we've had a few, but really not many high-profile Supreme Court nomination processes. You start in 1987 with Robert Bork. The fear is that he was unqualified because he was simply too conservative. By today's standards, it seemed, you say, well, so what? You just throw them on the court. But it was a big deal then, all right? Fast forward to 1991, Clarence Thomas and his proceedings, his Senate confirmation proceedings, concerns about sexual harassment. The one that I think is probably overlooked the most and probably ought to be studied more is probably the 2005 nomination by President Bush, the second President Bush, of Harriet Miers, who was seen as not to have a strong enough background because she didn't go to an elite law school. I think she went to Southern Methodist. I think that's something that ought to be studied a little bit more. And of course, just this year with Brett Kavanaugh,